I'm so looking forward to today's episode of Small Steps, Big Change. Many of the conversations we have had on this podcast have been around subject areas or circumstances that many of us, but not all of us, go through. Today's discussion with Marisa Renee Lee is one that can connect with everyone. Losing a loved one or having a really bad experience in life happens to us all. Marissa joins us to discuss the idea that healing from loss does not mean moving on, but instead that we need to strive to love those we have lost even after death. And when you really dive deep, you could sometimes find love that you didn't even feel when they were alive. Welcome to Small Steps, Big Change, the podcast where we meet extraordinary people who have used small steps to help create big change. I'm your host, Drew Sullivan. In August of 2020, after years of alcohol and cocaine use, I hit rock bottom. I knew at this moment that I had no choice but to get sober. Through lots of hard work and dedication, I made that a reality. I have to admit, I thought that this would fix everything and that a life filled with happiness would just follow. But sobriety was only the first step for me. I had to be sober before I was ever going to rebuild my life and recover all that was lost. I kept going, focusing on the next right move, or as I call it, the next small step. I then took the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one. Every day is a journey for me, and I now believe that I'm in the middle of the most beautiful recovery story of all time. What I have learned is that my story has a lot in common with anyone looking to make big changes in their life. That's why it is time that we work together to make big things happen. Each week on this podcast, I will introduce you to a friend who has used small steps to help create their big change. We are all going through something, and it is my goal that by sharing our stories and bringing vulnerability and empathy to the forefront, we can learn from each other and take the small steps that are needed to create big change. Marisa Renee Lee is a called-upon grief advocate, entrepreneur, and best-selling author of Grief is Love, Living with Loss. Deemed the friend we all wish we had in times of need by Elaine Welteroth, Marissa is able to utilize research-based advice and wisdom to help others navigate the complicated and dark emotions we face when experiencing loss, offering unique insights for women and Black communities. In addition to her work in the grief space, Lee is a former appointee in the Obama White House and CEO of Beacon Advisors, a mission-driven consulting firm primarily focused on racial equity. She is a rabble-rouser of social healing, former managing director of My Brother's Keeper Alliance, co-founder of the digital platform Supportal, and founder of the Pink Agenda, a national organization dedicated to raising money for breast cancer care, research, and awareness. Lee also regularly contributes to The Atlantic, Glamour, Vogue, MSNBC, CNN, and serves as an expert for Ritual's well-being app. She is a Harvard graduate and an avid home cook. Marissa lives in New York with her husband, Matt, their newborn son, Bennett, and their dog, Sadie. Welcome to Small Steps, Marissa. How are you?
I'm good and a little bit overwhelmed these days. I feel like as the holidays creep closer and closer, everyone's trying to squeeze so much into what's actually a short period of time. So just trying to take a step back and prioritize right now.
Yeah, I can only imagine in the work you do that, you're probably constantly having friends and family and just people come out of the woodwork around like, I just lost someone. Do you have any advice on how I can handle, this part of the process? And I can only imagine during the holidays that must be
Oh,
amped up.
yes. Oh, yes. As you know, we've had a really busy year with the release of Grief is Love. I also finalized the adoption of my son, Bennett, and moved to New York and. So I am planning to shut down for the year early because there's just too much going on in my personal life that I want to pay attention to right now.
That's so important. And it's amazing that you have that ability, which I think is
Oh,
just,
yeah.
again, it's inspiring to see people put that as a priority because we both know that there's so many people that don't. And I
Yep.
think that it makes total sense that you would have that lens based on what you've been through, which we'll talk about today. So that's great. I
Right.
mean, I think a great way to kind of say that. And we are going to talk about Grief is Love, as obviously that is a big part of your story and shares a lot about the ins and outs of that story. But before we do, one thing that I really love about your story is your work in the Obama White House. Can you share how your life and career led you to DC and what role in the administration that you had?
Absolutely. So when my mom was really sick, at this point, we had taken her off of all medications except for pain management stuff. So she was no longer getting treatment for her multiple sclerosis or for her cancer, because at this point, it was just all throughout her body. I heard a speech that then candidate Obama gave in Kansas, and he talked about, really leaning into the hope and all of the values and beliefs that this country was founded upon. And, we talked about this amazing future that he envisioned for all of us, where everyone would have access to opportunity and the ability to live up to whatever their fullest potential is. And I remember I was sitting at the time in my childhood bedroom, painted bright purple across the hall from my parents' room, balancing work on Wall Street and taking care of my mom. And I felt really angry and resentful. Here was this guy talking about all of these things that I believed in. I had a degree in government and political science, and all I wanted was to be out there on the campaign trail, preaching hope and change with all of these other diverse young people. And instead, I was at home taking care of a dying parent. And when my mom died, actually only a few weeks after I watched that speech, I was filled with obviously overwhelming waves of grief and pain and depression and anxiety and all the rest. But there was something about that loss that also gave me a deep sense of entitlement. I felt like the world, God, the universe, whoever you want to blame, had taken my most important person. And so I believed that I was entitled to the biggest, most badass career
Mm.
possible. And so after the president won election that November, I started working with friends who had been on the campaign to see if I could get a job in the administration. And in 2010, I moved from New York to DC and started working as a political appointee, first at the Small Business Administration and then inside the White House as a senior advisor on the Domestic Policy Council and also as the deputy director of business engagement for President Obama, leading efforts and initiatives in partnership with the business community, like the Affordable Care Act and My Brother's Keeper, which was a big program that we started that focused on young men and boys of color. It was an amazing ride. I continued working for the former president when I left the White House for a few years, and I will never not be grateful for that professional experience. I learned so much. It was just really amazing to feel like I had even a small opportunity to contribute to his legacy and helping our country.
Amazing. Relationship building and the power of people seem really ingrained in that role. And then obviously, what you did between, writing your book and being in office with President Obama. Were there any specific parts of your White House job and I guess the work you did as leading the nonprofit My Brother's Keeper that have helped you navigate the author and, dare I say, thought leader space? Technically, by definition, are a thought leader.
So I will say there are a few things that were helpful. And I say this for anyone, regardless of party or administration. When you are in the White House, the amount of work is nothing compared to like the amount of capacity. Like your capacity is, and I know people can't see my fingers, but your capacity is like 2 inches and the workload is more like 20 feet.
Got it.
So you are overwhelmed all the time. You learn to think critically and very quickly, very fast, and constantly shifting priorities. And we would have to respond to things that were happening in the world in real time. So you might start work on a Monday morning with a very clear, and I am very much a list maker, organized, strategic person. And so, like, you have your strategy and your plans and your priorities for the week. And then something terrible happens and everything changes and you are responsible for being a part of figuring out how to respond to those changes in the world, in the country, and in our internal priorities. So I think the ability to think critically and quickly, to be strategic and to respond to shifting priorities in a way that is thoughtful and mindful of resources. Like those are skills that I continue to use all the time. Obviously, public speaking and engaging with people who I think of as fancy, big, important thought leaders, like that's something we had to do a lot. So I got a lot of great practice in that. And then I would say one of the things that I learned in that job that's just been really useful for my own mental health and sort of how I manage work is the understanding that most of the work that we do in the world actually isn't as urgent as it seems. When you're in the White House and you are responding to things from the leader of the free world, like that's true urgency. I remember right before the government shut down back fall of 2013, you're working and then you're trying to figure out like, how do we prepare for the fact that tomorrow we probably won't be allowed back in the building because there's no funding? Like those are real urgent things. Whereas, most of my day to day client priorities, even thought leader work, if I have to pace it out in order to take care of myself, I'm able to remind myself that there is room to do that because it's not the White House. So that has probably been, frankly, one of the most important lessons, especially as I've transitioned over the last year or so into becoming a parent. Where, with kids, especially with really small children, there often are things that are more urgent than work. And being able to accept that and know that, the work will still be there, it will be okay, has been really helpful for me.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think the first episode that we had was with Juju Chang from ABC and Nightline. And she talks a lot about how she and her husband had to adapt with three sons that all played sports. And there were times that there were three baseball games going on in three different locations, and there's two of them, that they
Yeah.
had to adopt a policy with their children, even as they got older, around it's good enough. They taught their boys to understand that there's going to come a time where you have to say, okay, that's just good enough, and especially when there's physical limitations from doing something. And so what she said she learned from that personal interaction was also to adapt that professionally, in the sense that, if something is 99.99% there, you don't have to search for that 0.01%. You can
Yep.
say that that's good enough, and you can prioritize something else to not stay stuck on something that, may never be perfect, but that you want to obviously get to that place. So I feel like you may probably had moments like this when writing your book, where you were probably like, okay, did I hit that the right way? Did I get all of that out on the page?
Oh,
Am I telling that story the way that
yes.
I should? I'm so grateful you wrote this book. Personally, I know I've shared this with you a little bit, but not only have I read the book, but I have given a copy to my mother. I've given a copy to my aunt. I've given a copy to my best friend of 25 years who lost her mother 2 years ago at the start of the pandemic. And I gave it to them all because, not because I heard it was great, not because I, read about it in a blog or saw it on Good Morning America. It was because it impacted me. And so I felt to myself, if it impacted me the way it did, recently losing, my grandmother this past February, how can that impact other people? So my question is that why did you want to write this book? Was there a specific goal in mind? Was it personal? Was it to help others? Was it to get through the tough time?
So, as you know, my mom died a long time ago. It'll be 15 years in February.
Wow.
And before she passed away, my type A Harvard Wall Street self was like, I'm going to get organized. I'm going to be super prepared. I'm going to read Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's On Death and Dying. I'm going to do everything I can so that when it happens, it's not as bad. I truly thought that I could prevent, to some extent, like the pain of grief and loss. And then it happened. And obviously, I realized very quickly just how wrong I was. But because I had done all that preparation, I spent a lot of time after she died beating myself up and feeling like, why is this so hard? I did the work. I'm used to effort aligning with outcome. And I put in all of this effort, and the outcome was still just so shitty and painful and terrible at some point, and I wish I could remember what was the thing that was the tipping point for me. But 6 months after she died, something changed. And I decided there was nothing wrong with me. Where the problem sits is in how our culture talks about and treats grief and loss, and the expectations that we've all come to have around grief and loss as this thing where you go to the funeral, everybody's sad, mourning occurs over a period of, let's call it a week or two. and then you move on, you get over it, and go back to your life. Because I couldn't do those things, I thought that I was broken. And one day I just said, no, like this whole idea is completely wrong. And so I wrote in a journal at the time that I found when I was doing research for this book. It's August of 2008. I said, I'm going to write about grief and loss that is going to tell the truth about what grief really is and how it works. It's not going to be sad and depressing, and it's going to be a New York Times bestseller. And so far, I think we've checked a few of the boxes. We're still waiting for the New York Times to call, obviously, but it took over a decade to get to a place where I could write that book and where it was really time and I was really ready to write it. And it was ultimately prompted by a devastating pregnancy loss that Matt and I experienced after years of IVF and egg donors and infertility in late 2019. And I found myself just grieving the loss of my mom as I grieved that loss, because all I wanted was for her to be there to help me, to support me, to guide me through it. And then obviously a few months after we had our pregnancy loss, we all found ourselves in the midst of a global pandemic. And so my normal distractions, and both good ones and the ones that are sort of more vices that I would reach for during normal times, were gone. You know, I couldn't physically go to therapy. Like I couldn't go to church. I couldn't go out with my friends. Like I couldn't just go shopping and engage in some retail therapy in person for a couple of hours. No, all those things were gone. And I was just stuck at home writing and trying to figure out my feelings. And that ultimately led to an article that came out Mother's Day 2020 in Glamour, where I said, you know, I'm not over it. My mom's been dead for 12 years. I'm never going to get over it. And I don't care what anybody thinks. And that went somewhat viral and led to agents. And within a couple months, I had the deal to write Grief is Love, which came out in April.
I love that. I love the steps that you took because some of them were super intentional. Others just happened.
Exactly.
But it seems as if you were prepared for them to happen as they did, in the sense that because you were taking intentional steps towards finding a message that you could share with the world in a way that would help people and impact people based on your personal experience and what you had gone through this time, to understand that the loss and the pain from loss will never go away. You still were able to also lean in to kind of allow things to happen organically as well, which I think, you know, in anything that you're going through that's hard, there are those intentional steps you take. And then there are also just kind of those gut feelings, decisions that you make, or the way in which your decisions that you've made, that the universe and the world just provides opportunity or provides situations that make you think critically based off of other decisions you've made. One thing that you said that I think really overlaps well with the way society looks at addiction and recovery is this idea of how you're supposed to do it and what's supposed to happen. And once you get to this place, how your life is supposed to be. And I think that, you know, aligned with my own story in the sense that I never went to rehab and I never have gone to an AA meeting during this sobriety. During this sobriety. I mean, I've had failed attempts where I did. And I learned through those moments that that wasn't the setting for me to recover. But society tells you, and even to this day, people that are really close to me, some with medical backgrounds, you know, will say, are you sure you're ever going to be long-term sober without going to AA? And really trying to force what society tells us we're supposed to do down my throat. And for me, it's just, again, from the onset, it wasn't in the cards. And I think now, you know, 2.5 years into it, I've proven that to myself, which is all that really matters, that I made that.
This is your journey.
Exactly. And so I think that translates really well. And one thing that I really can't stand in life is when people tell me how I'm supposed to feel, or when I say I feel this way. And they say, you know, like, oh no, but you shouldn't. Okay, well, you know, you shouldn't be telling me how I feel. You know, there are so many beliefs and assumptions around how we're supposed to act and feel in so many different parts of our life, as I just shared with addiction for me. And you talk very intentionally around how we have to rethink the way people think and talk about grief. Was there a certain moment along your journey where the light bulb went off that this book isn't just to tell your personal story of how grief over loss doesn't go away, but also maybe kind of that light bulb went off that said like, aha, like this is it?
So the piece on society being wrong, like I just believed that for a really long time. And it was reinforced for me in the pregnancy loss. I just felt like, okay, if there's nothing wrong with me, okay, there's plenty of things wrong with me. But like in that instance, I was like, there's nothing wrong with me. So maybe where the problem sits is in how we talk about these things. And I just started casually sharing things on social media, whatever, seeing how people responded. And when people responded with such overwhelming support, it was like, oh, you're not crazy. And then the other thing that I grappled with and that I continue to grapple with and why like I don't like being called a grief expert and even thought leader, I like cringe a little bit is because I think the real experts in the grief space are the folks who are in academia and like leading research institutions and doing the work to help all of us better understand how grief impacts our bodies and our minds. And so what I tried to do with Grief is Love is weave my personal story in with that research and data because I don't want it to just be about Marissa. My life may be very different from your life, Drew, or somebody else's life. But if I bring in the research and the data, then it's here are the things that I learned, here's how I coped, and here are the things about how I coped that are supported by the leading research and data. So there's a good chance they'll work for you. Not everything is for everybody, but I wanted to write a book that was steeped in real expertise around grief and loss because I find so much of what exists out in the world, especially on social media and such, isn't really grounded in true expertise. And like, I want people to have that.
Yeah. And it seems as if you leaned into your personal story as kind of a baseline around kind of what you went through, what you personally feel,
Yeah,
and then pulled out those feelings to say, okay, let me talk to the researchers and the people that have this data and see, is this something that just happened to me? Is this something that happens to society as a whole? And then use your story as a way to tell that story
yeah,
with the support of research and with the support
exactly.
of experts to kind of give meaning to why you were feeling that way in that moment, why you
Yep,
had the situations that you had, which could then help it be transferable to others going through that.
exactly. That was the goal. My husband, one day, early on in the writing process, bless his heart, he said, why should people buy this book? What makes you an expert? It sounds kind of bratty, but when he asked that question, I thought to myself, what would make this book more meaningful? And for me, it was the research piece.
Yeah. My grandmother passed away, as I said, this past February. And sometimes I feel as if I haven't grieved the way I should, the way society kind of says it. But even in general, there are times I feel like I haven't grieved. Now, as I said, I read your book we connected very much soon after it came out. So I'd say right around that time is when I read the book. How important is it to understand that grief has no timeline and just this idea that the overall concept of your book is this idea that it doesn't go away? But is there a part of that that also kind of plays into like when you start grieving compared to when it ends? I mean, I know that you've said that grief
Yeah, I
doesn't go
mean,
away, but is it also delayed?
it can be. It absolutely can be. I think grief often ends up delayed for people who are having to deal with other big things or for people who are in survival mode. I think about so many people who lost loved ones during the pandemic. Many of them were also frontline workers themselves or had other family members to care for or children that they were responsible for. And because of that, I think there are a lot of people who were not able to fully grieve the losses they experienced these last couple of years, also because so much of the ritual surrounding loss was also taken away. So, can grief be delayed? Yes. Like the thing that I want people to understand about grief is that it is a very normal part of life. And it is something that you are going to encounter over and over again, whether it is continuing to grieve and create space for feelings that you have about a loss that's already occurred, or just all of the losses that we're each going to sustain throughout this life. I want people to get comfortable with the idea of grief being a normal life experience. And however you experience it, that is all about you and like who you are as a person and how you cope with things and what your relationship was like with the person who's no longer here. But fundamentally, it's just a normal part of life. That's what I want people to take away. And I redefine grief and grief as love as the repeated experience of learning to live in the midst of a significant loss, because I have found that with all of my life changes, there are always these grief moments. And sometimes they're lovely and I smile thinking about something that my mom said or did when my dad comes to my house and says something completely ridiculous. And I'm just like, oh my God, I wish she was here right now because that was insane. Or it'll just be sadness or some other form of challenge. I moved back to the area where I grew up with my husband and my kid, and my mom's not here. And I'm spending more time with just my father and my sister than I have ever before in my life. And so, like, there are a lot of adjustments with that. And it's grief. And I'm not like I'm walking around sad all the time, but it's more just, oh, this is weird because, like, she's still not here. What do we do with this? Like, what does this family look like without her?
And it seems as if you continue, I mean, let's manifest this to the universe. Like when there's the New York Times bestseller, I mean, that's going to be a moment where your mom is not going to be able to be there with you.
Exactly.
And so
Exactly.
I think what you're trying to say is that as your life progresses and you take on new challenges and you have new family
Yeah.
additions and you get married and you lose another loved one, like
Yeah.
even when there's future grief, you're going to grieve past
Yes.
loved ones because you're going to wish they were there with you going through that moment. This idea that community grieving is definitely a lot easier than when you're grieving in solitude and when you're by
Yep.
yourself. And I think that what I find about your story to be so interesting, but also something that I think we can all take from it is this idea, especially with this next chapter that you have moved and relocated back to where you grew up, is that you also can't run away from grief. And for you, it seems as if you're so, and of course you wrote the book, so you should have this perspective. But for you, it seems like you've also started to gain resilience when it comes to the idea that you can go into situations and have experiences that prior to even starting them, that there may be a trigger. And I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who avoid those situations like the plague because they're
And
like,
that's okay too.
yeah,
I did that for a while. When I say this is the first time that I've spent this much time with just my dad and just my sister, that means there were almost 15 years where I didn't spend as much time with them. I would see them a couple times a year, but the idea of moving back here or spending lots of time with them without her, like I was like, I can't do that. No, thank you. So I want to encourage people to be patient with themselves too, because there's no timeline. That also means, we all move through this stuff differently. And while I may be happy being here now, I do not think I would have been happy being here 10 years ago, 15 years ago, even 5 years ago. I don't think I could have made this move then. I just wasn't ready.
yeah. One area that the book covers is the impact of identity and gender, race, sexuality, and how that plays into mourning. And you note a few times in the book that there's expectations that society has, especially as a Black woman, that you're supposed to be strong and that you're supposed to be tough and that grief isn't supposed to impact you.
Yep.
And that to a degree, this kind of pressure and this kind of stigma slowed down your own grieving process. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah. The thing that I didn't realize until a couple years ago was that both race and gender absolutely impacted the way I moved through grief. Fundamentally, I think it is really hard to grieve if you don't feel a sense of safety. And I didn't feel like that was something that, when I was 24, 25, pretty much fresh out of school, working on Wall Street. In most environments there, I was either the youngest person, only woman, or the only Black person, or sometimes all of the above. And as wonderful as my company was, and as much support as people tried to show me, and they really did try, I just didn't feel comfortable completely letting my guard down in that environment. And fundamentally, even that environment was one of privilege for a Black person. But when I think about, in particular, around the pandemic, actually in general, the communities that are oftentimes most impacted by grief and death and loss and trauma are also most often the communities that are the most disconnected from the resources that enable you to move through those things in a way that's healthy, to heal and to learn to live with your trauma and your grief. And so I felt like it was really important in writing this book to at least start the conversation around grief and healing and equity. Because unfortunately, we don't create space for everyone's grief in this country. We don't create opportunities for everybody to access things that facilitate healing, like mental health support, even traditional physical health support, paid time off, etc. And so for me, my goal with Grief is Love and with all of my work is to both normalize the experience of grief and loss and to ensure that everyone has the same opportunity to heal.
Yeah, and I think that there's, an important point to make that a lot of the times the grief and loss that Black and Brown communities face, though it can be individual and it can be very much similar to the same type of loss that white folk experience, there's often times where grief and loss can be from a situation in the world that we know there's no solution to right now, or that our
Yeah.
politicians or our community leaders or the people in power are not finding solutions for. So, for example, our team represents Sabrina Fulton. And so when you
Yep.
see, obviously, that was over 10 years ago at this point with Trayvon being murdered, we've seen hundreds of unarmed Black and Brown young people that have been murdered by police and law enforcement and other people in power since then, right? And so I think that not only does someone like Sabrina and her family and those that lost Trayvon over 10 years ago have to continuously mourn the loss of Trayvon, they have to then relive that grief and loss every single time that they
Yeah.
see another shooting on television and the media cover this type of horrific tragedy the way they do. And the same way in which people who haven't lost a child or someone in their life that fits this category, they don't have to deal with the physical loss of someone, but they have to constantly feel as if that could be them next. And that also
Oh, yeah.
brings upon grief and loss just based on being a part of that marginalized community. So, I really appreciate that you make such an intentional kind of effort in that way, because your grief and loss that you have, when you do look at it on paper, based on who you've lost in your life and the type of loss you've had, without saying that you are a woman, and also that, well, I guess obviously with losing the child, that would be with a woman, but with the fact that you're Black as well. Like, those are
Yep.
things that happen to white people all the time. And I think it's really important that you distinguish the experience between the two based on that, because there's a lot of people out there that they just don't know. And it's not that they feel like don't understand that part of the conversation, but it goes back to the normalizing of grief and loss. It's the same
Yep.
way of normalizing that almost every single less than favorable situation that can happen to people in general, Black and Brown communities are further impacted by those situations. It's just out there for the world to see. And I think many people don't always attribute it to everything. And I think it's
Yeah.
really important to make sure that people do see that bigger picture, that this is an equity issue across the board. It's not just based on specific parts of our world that we want to pick and choose further, negatively impact. It's across the board. And one thing that I think did impact everyone is this idea that everyone went through so much grief during COVID. And that was in so many ways, whether it was physically losing people, losing business opportunities, losing the opportunity to graduate and walk with your
Yep.
classmates if you're in college or high school or elementary school. And in the corporate world, I think that they're in for, in my opinion, a difficult journey ahead, because I think that so many people had moments of grief and loss at home in the privacy of their own homes. And sometimes, especially in corporate America, if it doesn't happen right in front of you, it
You don't
tends
see
to
it.
just
Yep.
say it doesn't happen. Right. And so, what advice do you have for corporate leaders as they try to boost morale and build stronger community in the workplace, knowing that so many of their team members and their communities have suffered grief and loss during the past 2.5 years?
Yeah. So I have been advising a few corporate leaders on this. And I think the first and most important piece is acknowledgement. If you're feeling like your teams and your employees are suffering and struggling. And we all have been through a grief experience these last few years, like whether you lost someone during the pandemic or not. Like you said, you lost something at some point, if not multiple things. And so when leaders openly acknowledge these kinds of challenges and these more emotional issues, I think it makes it easier for people to feel like there is room for grief at work. And I think for better or worse, we need to create space for grief at work, in our communities, within our families and our friendships, etc. Because when people are hurting and that grief, that pain isn't acknowledged, it makes it harder to heal. And it also creates a deeper sense of isolation, which I think makes grief a lot harder to deal with and, makes it harder for you to navigate as an individual. And so I think for leaders, starting with finding ways to acknowledge the grief that employees and teams have experienced and in many cases are continuing to experience, and then doing a real assessment of the resources that your workplace offers for folks who are having a hard time is really important because fundamentally, and I say this as someone who owns their own business, has worked on Wall Street, like I get what the purpose is of owning and running a business, making money and outputs and outcomes and metrics and all those things. Like I understand all of that stuff very well. But at the end of the day, companies are just collections of individuals. And if your human capital, which is your most important and costliest resource, is suffering, your end product, your quarterly earnings, like everything else is going to suffer as well. And so I think it's really important to create room for these types of conversations in corporate America because fundamentally, we're not going to be able to succeed at anything if you're dealing with a workforce that's not fully there because of things.
Yeah, and I think that it's also important to note that managing the grief, managing the morale of your company, managing the, I guess, just the energy of how people are treating themselves and treating others. Managing is the wrong word, I think, because managing
Yeah.
means that you are trying to keep all of that in one central community and make sure that there are no ups and downs and that people conflict. And I think that sometimes managing that type of, the human capital part, as you said, is not good enough. Sometimes you have to, as you said, put in those services. And if you're not, and you're just managing what people are going through, you're actually doing them a disservice because at times you can be even enabling bad behaviors that it is your place as an employer where people spend a majority of their time throughout the day to create opportunities for people to get the resources that they need and get the help that they need as well. And I think that that's something that across the board, not just with grief and loss, but also with addiction and substance use abuse and with the mental health struggles that people are going through and bipolar disorder and so many parts of what people's makeups are that they bring to their work environments because that's normal and that's
We're
natural.
human beings.
Yeah, we're
Yes.
human beings. Is that if you are not guiding your employees in the direction of finding solutions and you are just trying to manage the situation at hand, what accommodations and what service and what good are you doing for that employee? And I don't think you're doing any good. I think you're worrying about yourself and you're worrying about your own environment and your own bottom line to try to manage everyone. Whereas if you are really in that position of trying to turn the tide and really trying to give people what they need to be successful and to see the bigger picture that when you do that, the
Yep.
company is also going to follow in that level of success. That's really where real leadership and that's where real support comes into play is to guide the employees that you notice or that have vocalized to you that they are struggling with a part of their personal life or a part of what's going on. And maybe it has a direct translation into work. Maybe it has everything to do with stuff outside of work. It is still the responsibility of the workplace to be able to put resources in place that are going
Mhm.
to help guide individuals in a positive direction, which will then build community and build stronger community to be able to see the organization thrive as well.
100%.
I saw firsthand the difference between my grieving process when my grandfather passed away in 2017 compared to how I grieved when my grandmother passed away earlier this year. In 2017, when I lost my Opa, I had been knee deep in drug and alcohol use at the time. I was self-medicating with drugs and alcohol instead of seeing the professionals and being a part of that routine and team that I
Yeah.
have now. And when my grandmother passed away 10 months ago at this point, I was a year and a half into sobriety. I was 2 months into recovery, self-discovery that I feel like I dove into a year into my sobriety. And the way in which I grieved and the way in which I led, I think, my individual person, but also my family when it came to grief and when it came to healthy grieving, it's night and day. And so I want to ask you, how important is self care and mental wellness when it comes to grief in general? And then how do you practice self care, at this point, knowing what you
Yeah.
know, but also just take us back to how maybe that has changed over the years?
I still struggle with self care. I had a belief for a really long time that anything that you could do for someone else and you instead do it for yourself is selfish, which is obviously not true. But so much of that is rooted both in culture, the culture of Black women in this country, like being caretakers, as opposed to being people who really intentionally care for and love themselves, and also being a caretaker at a really young age. Like my mom first got sick when I was 13, and I started helping to take care of her when I was 13. And so for me, a lot of my free time as a kid was spent going to the grocery store for our family or doing laundry or driving my sister to her activities so that my parents could focus on other things. Like it is a struggle for me and something that I have to work at pretty much every day. But one of the things that I realized through the process of losing our pregnancy and also all of the sort of self reflection and analysis you have to do when you write a book is that the self care that's marketed is often steeped in both capitalism and white supremacy. And I think self care is something that is way deeper and way more intentional, like what you do day to day to continue on your sobriety journey is very different from what I need day to day as a new mom, running a business, moving back home, dealing with the mom grief, etc. And I think that what I want to encourage and what I try to encourage everybody in my life to do is to just be really honest with yourself about what you need to be okay today. And then do the same thing tomorrow and be very intentional about it. Grief kind of comes and goes in waves over time. I'm sure the same is true for, a sobriety journey or for someone who's dealing with various mental health challenges or even for someone who's dealing with some physical health challenges or a disability. And so I encourage people to really like go inward and be intentional as opposed to just making the appointment at the spa, which I love. Don't get me wrong. But the greatest act of self care that I ever took was saying no to getting pregnant again. It was not fun. It was not something I was happy about. It was not something that I wanted to do, but it was the thing that I knew I needed to do. And now, that was fall of 2019 when I made that decision. And when I look at my life today, I am beyond confident that it was the right decision. But back then, it was a really difficult choice. And so I think thinking about self care in a deeper, more intentional, more personal way is really important. And so I do meditate and I work out and I write pretty much every day. Like those are the things that I do that are just for me. But I also every day check in with myself. How are you feeling? What are you worried about? What do you need? And what are you grateful for? And I let those questions guide whatever I need.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's similar with recovery the same way in the sense that sobriety recovery is hard. Grief is hard. But I think that the choices that we make when it comes to how do we speak to ourselves internally, how do we treat
Yes.
ourselves internally, when we know that there's something wrong that we're doing or how we're behaving or how we've been operating, there's a way to talk to yourself about it without beating yourself down, but to talk about
Exactly.
what's on the other side of that and what you can do differently to not only serve others, but to serve yourself in a better way. And when you make those small decisions, it makes recovery easier. It makes grief easier. And so
Yes, 100%.
when we're taking off some of those stressors that sometimes we cause ourselves based on how
Mhm.
hard we are on ourselves, the way in which we look at ourselves in the mirror, the way in which we think of ourselves in the meeting that we're in, all of those things play into our thought about ourselves. And I think that as we navigate these tough situations and these hard times, what we think about ourselves drives the way that we feel during those moments. And if you feel good about yourself, of course, it's going to make going through hard times easier because you know that you have yourself to help you get through them. And so I
Yep.
think, when you're in that place, that's where you can truly heal. You yourself are healed. And so you can then heal the wounds that this situation or this tough moment in your life have brought to the table without feeling as if you're hurting throughout your entire life. It allows you to focus in more on this specific situation and get
Yep.
still and get mindful and then work on how you're going to get through that situation without bringing your entire lens of what you think of yourself into the equation at the same time.
Yep.
I can't believe we're at the end already, but my favorite part of the podcast is our takeaway 10. It's 10 questions that I
Whoa.
ask each guest. They stay the same for each episode. What always makes you laugh?
My kids.
That's so funny. The last episode with Samara Bay, she said the same thing. I do not know how that feels. Maybe someday. If you could ask one person one question, who would it be and what would you ask?
I would ask my mom what her advice is for my life as a mother.
What advice do you have for young people entering the workplace?
I would say my number one piece of advice for young people entering the workplace is to find a way through work to really live your best life. You spend so much time working, and I just think it's really important for people to find the work that they're meant to do in the world.
How should we measure our lives? In years, in moments, in accomplishments, in something else?
In love, how much love were you able to receive? How much love were you able to give? Because fundamentally, I think that's what it's all about.
I love that. Name one thing about yourself that you will never change.
My love of Cheez-Its.
That's awesome. If you could, would you really want to live a life that is free from challenges and obstacles?
I don't even know what that looks like. So I'm going to have to say no, even though it sounds very tempting.
Which three people, past or present, would you invite to a dinner party?
That's a good one. Thich Nhat Hanh is this Buddhist philosopher that I love. I'd probably invite Barack Obama. He's pretty solid company. And then, gosh, a third one. Who would be a third one? I'm going to go with Oprah.
Wow, that seems like a really impactful dinner table. I can only imagine what a ticket for that would cost. Have you ever looked in the mirror and not recognized the person staring back?
Yes,
How do you define a community, and are you part of one?
I am a part of several. I would say one of my closest, most resilient, most supportive communities are my roommates from college. There are 12 of us, and we support each other through everything almost every single day. We talk to each other. It's pretty crazy and wonderful and amazing.
And it seems that evolves as time goes on with children and
Oh,
going through this
Lord.
and going through that, and of course, in
Yes.
grief. My sister has actually a similar situation with her roommates from BC. They have a similar kind of relationship, and they really lean on each other. And as an outsider, it looks extremely special. So I can definitely understand that. Last question: what are you grateful for in this moment?
My son, he's always top of mind. He started walking a week ago and he's hilarious. And he's also kind of crazy, like trying to pull the hair out of my head last night at bedtime. But yeah, beyond grateful.
Thank you so much, Marissa. It was a pleasure to have you on Small Steps, Big Change. Thank you for sharing your story and your book, Grief is Love. I hope that our listeners gained important insights on how we can better navigate grief, especially the idea that when we are able to own and honor what we have lost, we can experience a beautiful and joyful life, even during the hardest moments. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the Small Steps, Big Change podcast. I hope that this episode inspired you to let go of whatever is holding you back and take the first small step. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, follow our YouTube channel, the Small Steps, Big Change podcast, and connect with me on Instagram. Remember, no matter what you are going through, without taking small steps, you are limiting your potential to create big change. So take that first small step today. I promise you that you won't regret it.